Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of new motherhood, family relationships, and infidelity. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. I was 18 when I moved in with my aunt, Halo Acosta, 36 years old. My mother's younger sister. A woman who had lived too many lives in too little time. You could see it in the way she carried herself, shoulders back, chin up, always bracing for something. And yet, she had this lightness, too. A way of making things feel less heavy than they really were. That was Halo. A contradiction. And maybe that's why I never saw it coming. Moving in with her wasn't my first choice. Hell, it wasn't a choice at all. My mother, she wasn't built for parenthood. She tried, I think, in her own way. But every time a man came into her life, I became less of a priority. By the time I turned 18, I wasn't even an afterthought. I was an inconvenience. A loose end she was all too happy to pass off to someone else. Halo stepped in without hesitation. Told me her door was open, that I could stay as long as I needed. She made it sound like a favor, like she was doing it for me. But I think, deep down, she was just as lonely as I was. Two people orbiting different disasters, suddenly forced into the same small space. The house was small. 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a single bathroom. Not much privacy. Just thin walls and a hallway that always felt too short. It was the kind of place where you couldn't hide from anything, not from yourself, and definitely not from the person you lived with. She had rules. Nothing crazy, just the basics. Wash your own dishes. Don't leave your shoes in the hallway. If you use the last of the toilet paper, replace it. And one that stood out more than the rest, bathroom door stays locked when you're inside. That one had weight behind it. Like it mattered more than the others. I nodded when she told me, not thinking much of it. At the time, it felt like just another house rule. I didn't realize then how important that one was going to be. For the first few weeks, we moved around each other like strangers. I had a part-time job at a coffee shop, nothing special, just enough to keep some cash in my pocket. Halo worked from home. Something online, she never got into details. But I'd see her sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open, half-empty coffee beside her, typing with this intense focus, like whatever she was doing actually mattered. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, lost in thought. Like whatever she was working on wasn't just work. Like it was a distraction. She never said much about her past, but I picked up pieces. There was an ex, someone who had left a mark, though she never spoke his name. I knew he was bad news. I could see it in the way she flinched when her phone buzzed, how she ignored certain calls, let them ring until they stopped. How she'd sit in the dark sometimes, just drinking, staring at the floor. I never asked. She never offered. That was our unspoken agreement. But for all her walls, she wasn't cold. If anything, she was the opposite. She was loud, unapologetic. She swore too much, laughed too hard, made everything feel like it was happening at full volume. But sometimes I'd see the cracks. In the quiet moments. When she thought no one was looking. I remember one night, waking up to the sound of muffled crying. It was soft, barely there, like she was trying to keep it in. I didn't move. Didn't let her know I heard. But the next morning, when she walked into the kitchen, makeup perfect, smile in place, I knew. She was good at pretending. Better than me. And then there was me. 18. No real experience with anything. I'd never had a girlfriend. Never even kissed anyone. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had time. But in the quiet, it was all I could think about. What I was missing. What it would feel like. If I was even capable of it. Living with Halo didn't help. Not in the way you think. It wasn't like that. Not at first. But she was there. Constantly. She was the first person I saw in the morning, standing at the stove in an old tank top, hair in a messy bun, swaying her hips to music only she could hear. The last person I heard at night, murmuring to herself in the living room, fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. She was everywhere. And I started noticing things. Things I shouldn't have. Like the way she smelled. Vanilla and something else, something warmer. It lingered, on the couch, on the towels, on my sheets if she sat on my bed for too long. Or the way she bit her lip when she was thinking. The way she pulled her hair up, twisting it at the nape of her neck, exposing smooth, golden skin. The way she stretched in the mornings, arms over her head, shirt lifting just enough to make my stomach clench. I tried to ignore it. To push it down. To remind myself that she was family. That she was older. That this was wrong. But it didn't change the way my body reacted. The way my thoughts spiraled when I was alone in my room at night. The way I started avoiding her eyes, because I was afraid she'd see what I was thinking. It was innocent. Completely. Until it wasn't. There was a moment. A shift. A crack in something I thought was solid. And it all started with a door that should have been locked. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. It started the way it always did. Late at night. The house, quiet. The air, thick with the kind of silence that only exists when two people are awake in different rooms, pretending they're alone. Halo was in the living room. I knew that much. Curled up on the couch, half a glass of wine in her hand, eyes locked onto some true crime show. She liked those. The ones where the bad guy always got caught in the end. The ones that made sense. She never looked away from them, never got distracted. That's what I told myself, anyway. I told her I was going to bed. She barely glanced up, just waved a hand, her fingers lazy, dismissive. I hesitated for half a second, watching her. The way her legs were folded under her, the way the dim glow of the TV flickered across her face. Then I turned away, headed down the hall, and closed myself in the bathroom. The room was small. Cramped, really. The kind of space where the mirror fogged up within minutes, where the heat had nowhere to go. The shower tiles were old, cracked in some places. The door had a push-button lock. Faulty. It stuck sometimes, only half engaging, but I thought I had locked it. I always did. So I didn't check. I should have checked. I turned on the water, let it get hot. Stepped in. Let the heat roll over me, let it sink into my skin, my muscles, loosening something tight in my chest. It was a routine, something familiar. Something private. My head dipped forward, eyes closed, the sound of the water filling my ears, blocking out everything else. My hands drifted lower. It wasn't the first time. Wouldn't be the last. Just a moment to myself, nothing more. And then the door opened. I didn't hear it at first. Not over the water. But I felt it. The shift in the air. The way something cold slipped into the space, unsettling the warmth. A presence where there shouldn't have been one. Then, a sharp inhale. Soft. Sudden. Like the sound someone makes when they've stepped into something they can't step back from. My eyes snapped open. Through the fogged-up glass of the shower door, I saw her. Halo. Standing there. Hand on the doorknob. Motionless. And for a split second, just a second, we made direct eye contact. The steam blurred the space between us, softened the lines, but I saw her face. The way her lips parted just slightly. The way her eyes widened, her whole body going stiff. The way she didn't move. Didn't look away. Not at first. Then, like a snap, something shifted. Her gaze dropped. A sharp, instinctive movement. Her face flushed, her breath hitched, just barely, just enough for me to catch it. Then, oh, shit. Sorry. Her voice. Not loud. Not sharp. Just, flustered. Rushed. The words stumbling over themselves, like she was trying to force them out before something else could slip in. And then she was gone. The door shut. Not slammed. Just closed. Quick. Abrupt. Like she was sealing the moment away before it could spread. I was frozen. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath coming too fast, my skin burning, not from the water, but from something else. Something I couldn't name. I should have moved. Should have reached for the towel, shut off the water, done anything but stand there, stunned. But my body didn't listen. My mind was stuck on a loop, replaying the moment over and over. The look on her face. The way she hesitated. The way her breath caught before she spoke. The way she looked down before she left. She had been embarrassed. Maybe more than I was. And that was the part one couldn't shake. Because embarrassment is one thing. But hesitation? That was something else entirely. My hands clenched at my sides. The water kept running, but I barely felt it now. The heat was suffocating. Pressing in from all sides. I forced myself to move, to reach forward and shut it off. The silence that followed was deafening. I grabbed the towel, wrapped it around my waist. My movements felt sluggish, disconnected, like I was still trapped in that moment, like it was refusing to let me go. I stepped out of the shower, feet hitting the cold tile. The air felt different. Thick. Charged. Like the whole house was holding its breath. I listened. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing. She was gone. But I knew, without a doubt, that she was thinking about it just as much as I was. The house felt different after that night. Not louder. Not colder. Just, off. Like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for someone to say something that neither of us was brave enough to say. We didn't talk about it. Not that night. Not the next morning. Halo acted like nothing had happened, and I tried to do the same. But it was there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for a crack to slip through. Invisible, but heavy. Breakfast was quiet. She sat across from me, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the liquid like it held the answer to something she didn't want to ask. She didn't meet my gaze. I barely touched my food. Every time I tried to eat, my stomach tightened, like it was bracing for something. And the worst part? The worst part was that she didn't seem angry. She wasn't cold, wasn't distant in the way you'd expect. If anything, she was trying too hard to act normal. Like she was afraid that if she acknowledged the tension, it would become real. I left the house around noon. Just to get out. Just to breathe. I wandered around town for hours, ending up at a coffee shop I didn't even remember walking into. I sat there, staring at my phone without really seeing it, replaying the moment over and over again. The way her eyes widened when she saw me. The way her breath caught, just for a second. The way she looked down, like she wasn't sure where else to look. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That it was just embarrassment. Awkwardness. That's all. But there was something else there. Something I couldn't explain, and that made it worse. By the time I got home, the sun was setting. The house was dim, shadows stretching across the floor. Halo was in the living room, curled up on the couch, her legs tucked under her, flipping through channels without really watching anything. I hesitated in the doorway. She didn't look up. Didn't say anything. Just kept scrolling through the same 3 channels like she was searching for something but didn't know what. I could have gone to my room. I should have. But instead, I walked over and sat down on the couch next to her. Not too close, but not far enough to feel like I was avoiding her. For a while, we just sat there. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was waiting for something. Finally, without looking away from the TV, she spoke. "So, about earlier." My chest tightened. I tried to keep my face neutral, to act like it wasn't a big deal, but my pulse was already racing. "Yeah?" She sighed, turning her head to look at me. Her eyes were soft, but there was something else there. Something careful. Like she was measuring her words before she let them out. "I just want to make sure you're okay," she said. "You seemed—" "I don't know." "Rattled." I let out a nervous laugh. "I think that's an understatement." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Then she shifted, pulling her legs up and wrapping her arms around her knees. She always sat like that when she was uncomfortable, like she was trying to make herself smaller. "Look," she said, her voice softer now. "You're young. You have needs. That's normal. You don't have to feel weird about it." My face burned, but I held her gaze. There was something strange about this conversation. Not just because we were having it, but because of how she was saying it. Like she wasn't just talking to me, like she was talking to herself, too. "I know that," I said quietly. She nodded, running a hand through her damp hair. It was down tonight, loose around her shoulders, still wet from her shower. She was wearing her usual pajamas, soft shorts, and an oversized t-shirt that slipped off one shoulder. It wasn't anything she hadn't worn before, but tonight it felt different. Or maybe I was just different. She shifted again, turning toward me, her arm resting on the back of the couch. "I just don't want you to feel embarrassed. It was an accident. No harm done." I nodded, forcing a small chuckle. "Yeah. No harm done." But that wasn't entirely true. Something had changed. Something small, something unspoken. But it was there. The conversation should have ended there. It would have, normally. But it didn't. She looked at me for a moment, her gaze lingering just a little too long. And then, almost absent-mindedly, she reached out and placed her hand on my shoulder. It was supposed to be reassuring. A simple gesture. But her fingers stayed there, just a second longer than they needed to. Just long enough for me to notice. The warmth of her hand. The way her thumb brushed against my shoulder, barely there, but enough to make my breath hitch. She must have noticed. She pulled her hand back quickly, like she'd touched something too hot. She cleared her throat, sitting back against the couch. "Anyway," she said, her voice a little too casual. "Just wanted to make sure we're good." I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah. We're good." But the truth was, I didn't know if we were. Because that moment, her hand, her touch, the way she pulled back like she wasn't sure if she should have done it in the first place, it stuck with me. It was small. Insignificant, maybe. But it was enough to make me wonder. I didn't know what it meant. And that scared me more than anything. Something shifted that night. Not in a way I could explain. Not in a way that made sense. But I felt it. In the silence. In the way the air seemed thicker when we were in the same room. In the way she looked at me, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. For the next few days, we danced around it. Around each other. She wasn't avoiding me, not exactly, but something had changed. Our conversations were shorter. Our interactions were careful. Measured. Like we were both trying not to acknowledge the thing sitting between us. It wasn't until Friday night that it happened, the moment that made everything even more complicated. She had just gotten out of the shower, her hair damp, an oversized t-shirt hanging off her shoulder. It wasn't anything unusual. But I noticed it differently now. Or maybe I was just noticing everything differently now. She sat on the couch, tucking her legs under herself, flipping absently through channels. I sat beside her, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin. We hadn't talked much that day. But tonight, it felt like neither of us wanted to be alone with our thoughts. For a while, we just watched the screen, neither of us really paying attention. And then, out of nowhere, she spoke. "You ever feel like you're just waiting for something to happen?" I turned my head, studying her face. The way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. The way her lips parted slightly, like she wasn't sure she should have said it aloud. "What do you mean?" She exhaled slowly. "I don't know. Like life's supposed to be more. But you're just stuck. Like no matter what you do, nothing really changes." I swallowed. I knew that feeling all too well. "Yeah," I admitted. "I get that." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I used to think things would be different by now. That I'd have it all figured out. But here I am, 36, still waiting for something to make sense." I hesitated. Then, before I could stop myself, I said it. "You ever regret things?" She looked at me then. Not just a glance. A real look. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching. "Yeah," she said finally. "All the time." A beat of silence. Then she shifted slightly, turning toward me, her arm resting on the back of the couch. "What about you?" she asked. "Any big regrets?" I hesitated. Then, before I could overthink it, I answered honestly. "I don't know if it's regret," I said, my voice quieter now. "More like, wondering. If I missed something. If I was supposed to have experienced more by now." Her expression softened. "You mean relationships?" I nodded. I trailed off, feeling stupid for admitting it out loud. She didn't laugh. She didn't tease me. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering me. "That's not a bad thing, you know," she said. "There's no rush." "Maybe," I said. "But it doesn't feel that way." She exhaled, running a hand through her damp hair. "I get it," she admitted. "I haven't been with anyone in a long time either." "Not since," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Doesn't matter." But it did. I could hear it in her voice. The weight of whatever she wasn't saying. She looked at me then, really looked at me. And before I could think better of it, I asked something I probably shouldn't have. "Do you miss it?" Her lips parted slightly, like she wasn't expecting the question. Then, after a long pause, she answered. "Sometimes." The room felt smaller. Warmer. My pulse was too loud in my ears. We weren't saying anything we shouldn't, but it still felt like we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't name. And then she smiled. A slow, teasing smile. "You're kind of shy, huh?" I let out a breathless laugh. "I guess." She reached out then, fingers brushing against my forehead, pushing my hair back. It was such a simple gesture. Casual. Playful. But my skin burned where she touched me. "Nothing wrong with that," she murmured. Her hand drifted lower, resting against my chest for just a moment. It was meant to be reassuring. Just a touch. But she didn't move away right away. And neither did I. The air between us changed. My heart pounded. My breathing slowed. Every part of me was hyper-aware of the space between us, the space that was slowly disappearing. I didn't mean to move. Or maybe I did. But my hand found her leg, resting just above her knee. She didn't pull away. Didn't tense. Just stayed there, watching me. The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain. My fingers traced a slow, careful path, grazing her collarbone, then lower. Testing. Waiting. Her breath hitched. And then, she pulled back. "This isn't right," she whispered. But her voice lacked conviction. She wasn't looking at me now. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her jaw tight. Like she was trying to convince herself of something. My heart was still racing. My mind was still spinning. But reality was creeping in now, pushing through the haze. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sit back, to put space between us. "I should go to bed," I muttered. She nodded, not looking at me. "Yeah. You should." But neither of us moved right away. And that was the part that scared me the most. The thing about tension is, it doesn't just disappear. It sits there, beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. You can ignore it, pretend it's not there, but eventually, it demands to be felt. That night, everything came to a head. Halo had been quiet all day. Not distant, not cold, just in her own head. I could see it in the way she moved, the way she kept rubbing her temples like she was trying to chase away a thought she didn't want to have. I felt it too. The weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I should have gone to bed early. Given us both space. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself in the living room again, sitting next to her on the couch, too close to be casual, too far to feel natural. The TV was on, playing some old movie neither of us was watching. The air felt thick. Heavy. Like the whole house was holding its breath. And then, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against my hair, pushing it back from my forehead. A small, simple gesture. But it didn't feel small. Not anymore. Her hand lingered, just for a second. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough for her to notice that I noticed. She let out a breath. It wasn't shaky. It wasn't controlled. Just something in between, like she was still deciding what this moment was supposed to be. "William," it was the first time she had said my name like that. Soft. Careful. Like she wasn't sure if she should be saying it at all. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my throat. "Yeah?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let her hand drop, resting lightly on my chest. Not pushing me away. Not pulling me closer. Just there. The space between us shrank. The air grew warmer. My heart pounded so hard I was sure she could feel it beneath her palm. "This is a bad idea," she whispered. She was right. And we both knew it. But neither of us moved. Her fingers twitched against my shirt. My hand, resting on my thigh, curled slightly, like my body was waiting for permission to react. I could feel the tension vibrating between us, this invisible thread stretched so thin it was bound to snap. And then, it almost did. My hand shifted, barely, just an inch, brushing against her leg. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I felt the warmth of her skin beneath my fingertips. She inhaled sharply. A small, barely there sound. But I heard it. And more than that, I felt it. That was the breaking point. She pulled back, not fast, not abrupt, but deliberate. Like she had just woken up from a dream and realized where she was. Her eyes met mine, wide and uncertain. Then, her gaze dropped to where her hand had been, like she was trying to retrace her own movements, to understand how we had gotten here. I opened my mouth to say something, to break the silence, before it swallowed us whole. But she beat me to it. "This can't happen." Her voice was firm, but underneath it, there was something else. Something almost like regret. I swallowed, nodding slowly. "I know. But if we both knew, why did it feel like we were waiting for something?" She exhaled, running a hand through her hair, suddenly restless. "I shouldn't have," she cut herself off, shaking her head. "It's late. You should go to bed." She wasn't looking at me now. She was looking past me, at the TV, at the floor, anywhere but me. I hesitated, my hands clenching into fists against my thighs. "Halo," she stood up, not giving me the chance to finish. "Good night, William." And just like that, the moment was over. But the damage had already been done. Neither of us spoke after that night. But the silence was loud. It sat between us, pressing in from all sides, thick and suffocating. We had spent so much time avoiding the tension, pretending it wasn't there, and now we couldn't pretend anymore. Something had changed. And we both knew it. I wanted to talk about it. To say something. But every time I opened my mouth, the words felt wrong. Because how do you talk about something you don't even understand? Halo avoided me. Not in an obvious way. She still moved around the house like normal, still left her coffee cup on the counter, still sat in the living room with the TV on too loud. But she was careful now. Measured. She wouldn't meet my eyes for too long. She wouldn't sit too close. And if we ended up in the same room, she always found a reason to leave first. And that was worse than anything else. Because it wasn't just avoidance. It was regret. I heard it in her voice the next morning, in the way she said my name like it was something fragile, like if she wasn't careful, it might break. William, we need to forget about last night. She didn't wait for my response. She just said it. Like it was a decision she had already made. A door she had already shut. I should have said something. I should have told her that I couldn't just forget. That it wasn't that simple. But instead, I just nodded. Because what else was I supposed to do? So we pretended. Or at least, she did. She acted like nothing had happened. Like nothing had changed. But the tension was worse now. Because it was real. It wasn't just something lingering beneath the surface anymore. It was there, in every glance, in every moment of silence, in the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. I caught her once, standing in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter so tight her knuckles were white. She didn't hear me come in at first. And for a brief second, I saw it, everything she was holding back. The conflict. The guilt. The fear. And then she noticed me. She let go of the counter, smoothed out the tension in her shoulders, and gave me a small, forced smile. Hey. Just one word. But it felt like a wall slamming down between us. Hey, I muttered back. She grabbed her coffee cup and walked past me, her movements too fast, too deliberate. And just like that, the moment was gone. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The regret in her eyes. The way she had to force herself to act normal. The way she was trying so hard to push it down, to make it disappear. And maybe that was the difference between us. She wanted to forget. And I wasn't sure I could. The following days were unbearable. The house, once small but comfortable, felt suffocating now. Every interaction between us was careful, like we were walking across a frozen lake, terrified of what might happen if the ice cracked beneath us. At night, I could hear her moving around in her room. I wondered if she was sleeping at all. I wasn't. During the day, she kept herself busy. She cleaned, rearranged furniture, worked more than usual. Anything to avoid sitting still. I wanted to say something. To fix whatever was broken. But I didn't know how. And then, one night, it got worse. It was late. The house was quiet. I couldn't sleep, so I found myself in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching it. And then, I heard her door open. I expected her to ignore me, to walk straight to the kitchen or the bathroom like she had been doing all week. But she didn't. She stopped. Just for a second. Just long enough for our eyes to meet across the dimly lit room. It was only a glance. But it was enough. Because in that moment, I saw everything. The guilt. The uncertainty. The hesitation. The part of her that wanted to say something, but didn't know what. And then, she looked away. Go to bed, William, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, she was gone. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty doorway, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't understand. Because that was when I realized something. This wasn't just about what happened that night. This was about everything that came after. The way we were both pretending. The way we were both trying to convince ourselves that this tension didn't exist. The way we were both avoiding a conversation we didn't know how to have. And the worst part? I didn't know if we could ever go back to the way things were before. Halo started avoiding me after that night. Not in a way that was obvious to anyone else. Just in the small ways. The way she wouldn't meet my eyes for too long. The way she left the room the moment I entered. The way she stopped sitting close to me on the couch, like even the space between us had become dangerous. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That I was imagining it. That maybe I was the one making things weird. But I wasn't. She was distant. More than distant. She was gone. She buried herself in work. Spent more time in her room. Left the house for long stretches without saying where she was going. And when we did speak, her voice was too light, too careful, like she was trying to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. Like she was trying to erase whatever had happened between us. But the thing about pretending? It only works if both people believe it. And I didn't. At first, I told myself I didn't care. That if she wanted to act like nothing had happened, fine. I could do the same. But the more she pulled away, the worse it got. I became restless. On edge. Every time she left the room, I wanted to follow. Every time she spoke to me, I searched her face for something, anything, that told me she still felt it too. I found myself looking for excuses to be near her. Brushing past her in the kitchen just to see if she'd react. Sitting next to her on the couch, waiting for her to move away. And when she did, when she pulled back, it only made something inside me tighten. It was like I was chasing a ghost. Something that had been real once, but was slipping through my fingers, no matter how hard I tried to hold on. And then, one night, I reached my breaking point. It was late. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't turn off my thoughts. So I did what I always did, I found her. She was in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it. The glow of the screen flickered against her skin, casting shadows across her face. She looked tired. Not physically. Just emotionally worn down. I hesitated in the doorway. And for a second, I almost turned around. Almost left her alone. But I didn't. Instead, I walked over and sat beside her. Closer than I should have. She stiffened, just barely. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but I saw it. I felt it. "We need to talk," I said quietly. She exhaled, shaking her head. "William, no," I cut her off. "No more pretending. No more avoiding me. Just, be honest." She didn't look at me. She just stared at the screen, fingers gripping the edge of her t-shirt, like she was holding on to something only she could see. I swallowed, my chest tight. "Halo, talk to me." She finally turned her head. And for the first time in days, she really looked at me. Her eyes were heavy with something I couldn't name. Guilt? Regret? Fear? "This was a mistake," she said. The words hit harder than I expected. My throat went dry. "What?" She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I never should have let things get this far. It wasn't fair to you. And it can't happen again." I stared at her, a sharp pain settling in my chest. "You don't understand." Her gaze snapped back to mine. "No, William. You don't understand." Her voice was sharp now. Almost desperate. "This, whatever this is, it's not okay. And it has to stop." I clenched my fists. "Why? Because you suddenly decided to feel guilty?" Because I'm the adult, and I should have known better," she interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "Because you don't see the consequences the way I do." I let out a hollow laugh. "So what? You're saying I don't know what I want?" She shook her head. "I'm saying you're young. And confused. And this," she gestured between us, her hands shaking slightly, "this isn't what you think it is." I felt something snap inside me. You wanted this just as much as I did. Her expression crumbled for just a second. Just long enough for me to see the truth. She had wanted it. Maybe still did. But that didn't change the fact that it was wrong. She exhaled, pressing her fingers to her forehead. This can't happen again. The finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut. And for the first time I realized I had already lost. I knew she was leaving before she even said it. You can always tell when someone is about to walk away from you. There's a shift, something small, but undeniable. The way they move. The way they look at you. The way they start preparing for an ending before the words even come out. That morning, I saw it in the way Halo stood at the kitchen counter, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, staring at nothing. The way her shoulders tensed, like she was bracing for something. The way she kept exhaling slowly, like she was trying to steady herself. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched her, waiting. And then, she said it. I think I need to leave for a while. Just like that. No build-up. No warning. Just a sentence that cracked something deep inside my chest. I gripped my glass a little tighter, staring at her. I don't know what I was expecting her to say, but it wasn't that. For how long? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Just kept tracing the edge of her cup. Finally, she sighed. I don't know. I felt my stomach tighten. I set the glass down, suddenly unable to hold it anymore. You don't have to do this, I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. She finally turned to look at me. And that was the worst part. Because the moment I saw her face, I knew I had already lost. I do, William. She said my name softly, like it was something fragile. Like she was already mourning whatever it was we had been to each other. This is too much, she continued. For both of us. I need distance. And so do you. I shook my head. That's not true. No, it wasn't loud. It wasn't harsh. But it was final. I felt something inside me crack. She exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. We can't pretend this didn't happen, she said. And we can't act like nothing's changed. Because it has. And I don't know how to fix that. Neither did I. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what to say. I wanted to ask her to stay. To promise we could figure it out. That things didn't have to be like this. But I couldn't say any of those things. Because deep down, I knew she was right. She gave me a small, sad smile. The kind that barely reached her eyes. I'll start packing, she murmured. And just like that, it was decided. The house felt different that evening. Like something had already shifted, like it was preparing for the emptiness she was about to leave behind. I stood in the doorway of her room, watching her pack. She didn't notice me at first. Or maybe she did, but she was pretending not to. She moved slowly, methodically, folding clothes, zipping bags, carefully choosing what to take and what to leave. Every now and then, she would pause, fingers resting on something, a book, an old sweater, a framed photo. And each time, I saw it. The hesitation. The quiet sadness. The weight of saying goodbye to something she didn't have the words for. She picked up a small bracelet from the nightstand, rolling it between her fingers. I recognized it. A cheap, worn-out thing she had always kept, but never really wore. Something sentimental, though I never knew why. She turned it over in her hands, lost in thought. Then, slowly, she set it back down. She wasn't taking it with her. I cleared my throat, and she flinched slightly, like she had forgotten I was there. She turned to face me, eyes tired but steady. You gonna be okay? She asked softly. I forced a nod. Yeah. It wasn't a lie. Not really. I would be okay. Eventually. She studied me for a moment longer, like she was memorizing my face. Then she turned back to her suitcase, zipping it up. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. Halo, she paused. But she didn't turn around. What if, I stopped myself, exhaling sharply. Shaking my head. She turned then, her expression unreadable. What? I hesitated. Then, finally, I let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. She nodded slightly. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked past me. The front door was open. The night air was cool against my skin. She stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, hesitating. For a brief second, I let myself wonder if she would change her mind. She didn't. She exhaled slowly, turning to face me one last time. Take care of yourself, William. Her voice was soft. Careful. Final. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. You too. She gave me one last look. And for a second, for just a second, it looked like she was going to say something else. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped outside. And the door closed behind her. I stood there for a long time after she was gone. Listening to the silence. Letting it settle into my bones. She was gone. And for the first time I was truly alone. Have you ever been tempted to cross a boundary you knew you shouldn't? What would you have done in my position? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe for more.